Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today, The Trump Administration's Domestic Policies, Insights from History. Today's show is brought to you by the College of Arts and Sciences and the History Department at The Ohio State University and the magazine Origins, Current Events, and Historical Perspective. My name is Nick Breyfogle. I'm a professor of history and director of the Goldberg Center for Excellence in Teaching, and I'll be your host and moderator today. Since the administration of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the first 100 days of a new administration are taken as a moment to reflect on the successes and failures of the president and his agenda. Perhaps more than any presidency before, the second Trump administration has changed domestic policies and domestic systems of government in rapid, profound, and interconnected ways, and often through waves of executive orders. These have included efforts to dismantle the federal bureaucracy and lay off federal workers, rapid steps to increase the power of the executive branch, especially at the expense of Congress and the judiciary, the imposition of tariffs in an effort to remake the American economy, reductions to social services, such as proposed cuts to Medicaid and increases in military spending, a fundamental change to policy approaches regarding questions of race and gender and sexuality, new policies on immigration and deportation and an effort to redefine citizenship, antagonistic relations with journalists, universities, law firms, and professional expertise. And these are just a few of the changes that have been brought in domestically in the past 100 days. Today, we're joined by four Ohio State history professors, Maria Hammack, Clay Howard, Daniel Rivers, and Bart Elmore. And they are bringing their expertise to us today for a conversation that puts American domestic policy changes during these first 100 days of the second Trump administration into historical perspective. Each of our four panelists will offer a few minutes of introduction on different aspects of the new domestic policy patterns that they think are most important and how those policies fit into larger historical patterns. They'll be looking especially at questions of LGBTQ policies, environmental programs, the relationship of universities and federal power, and immigration and citizenship. After their opening remarks, our panelists will respond to your questions. Many of you submitted questions when you registered, and we'll answer some of those to begin with. If you're interested in asking a question, please write it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. As a reminder, this event will be recorded, posted at a later date on YouTube, and made available to everyone who has registered for the webinar. Also, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the land the Ohio State University occupies is the ancestral and contemporary territory of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandot, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples. Specifically, the university resides on land ceded in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville and the forced removal of tribes through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. We want to honor the resiliency of these tribal nations and recognize the historical contexts that have and continue to affect the indigenous peoples of this land. So, without further ado, let me pass over to our marvelous panelists, and we'll begin with Dr. Daniel Rivers. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks so much, Nick. And thanks to everybody for taking part in the webinar here today. And special thanks to Nick and Alex for having us here and for all the work they've done on the webinar. So when Nick asked me to participate in this, I thought about different things that I could say about Trump's first 100 days and its effect on different aspects of gender and sexuality. And I think that the most important thing to focus on is the spate of executive orders that we've had directed at trans rights, at the rights of transgender men and women in the United States. That's a really important part of what we've seen happening over the last few months. And I just wanted to sort of put that in historical context for you all, give you some ways to think about the larger arc that comes into play here with these executive orders. I think the first thing I would say is that if we think about trans history, what we're looking at is not only state intervention, repression of transgender and gender non-normative communities, but resistance to that stretches back for a century and a half. I think that we tend to think in mainstream American culture of both trans experiences and politics and debates over trans lives and rights as being something novel. When anything, it's, nothing could be farther from the truth. So one way of thinking about this actually ties into our own city of Columbus, Ohio. Nationwide, in the last half of the 19th century and predominantly the first half of the 20th century, although some of it extends farther than that, we see the passing of laws banning cross-dressing in the United States. That often surprises students when I teach trans history, that is a long-standing occurrence. Columbus, Ohio passes the first law against cross-dressing in 1848. And we see in the last half of the 19th century a whole slew of cross-dressing laws passing. And these are used up until a time of their repeal, which probably not surprisingly to many of you occurs in the 1970s. So, for over a century, these are used to police, to terrorize, to marginalize trans individuals, gender nonconforming individuals. So that's one way we can think of this large repression of trans individuals that these executive orders are a part of. In the 20th century, in that long period, we see a few really important ways in which violence and oppression of trans people occur that I think are historically salient to the current moment. One is the struggle of trans individuals in prisons and in carceral situations. If we look throughout the 20th century, you can see record of trans individuals, particularly trans women, being subject to deadly violence, to rape, to forms of terrorizing within prison. And we see as part of a trans freedom struggle by the late 1960s and into the 1970s, and much of this early work was actually done by the ACLU, just to give them credit, we see a push towards demanding safety for trans women in penal situations. And a lot of this actually was done on the part of trans individuals themselves. Dee Farmer, a Black trans woman who suffers horribly in prison, is raped in prison, and she actually takes her case to the US Supreme Court. And in 94, the court makes a historic decision where they say that trans individuals and prisons have a responsibility towards not only trans individuals but to all inmates who they can reasonably suspect that they will face violence and threats. And this leads to federal changes. This is under attack by Trump's executive order specifically. What the executive orders are doing is they're seeking to federally define gender and sex, and to say that sex begins chromosomally, it begins at conception. And when we look at the history of trans resistance, um, we see that beginning in the 50s and 60s, with the aid of a new wave of sympathetic medical practitioners and attorneys, we see a new paradigm emerge with the development of this idea called of gender identity. And gender identity gives some space for institutional support for trans individuals. And we see the emergence of clinics in the 1960s at Johns Hopkins and Stanford and other universities where trans individuals can, for the first time, access surgical transition and other forms of assistance. And when we look at the executive orders, one thing they seem to really have in common is an attempt to actually roll back this notion of gender identity towards a concept of sex as being simple, binary, and defined at conception. And this is meant to lead all kinds of federal policies, including passports, driver's licenses. The first case that allowed trans individuals to actually change their name on government identification was in 1968 in New York State. And that's followed by a whole wave in the 1970s and 1980s of decisions that granted trans individuals the right to change their sex on government documents. And it is indeed all of these rights that are specifically under attack. And I want to offer you all a perspective on this that is also a perspective of resistance, of a trans freedom struggle that is a part of the modern LGBT freedom struggle that emerges in the late 1960s and 1970s as trans individuals push back against some of these long-standing, more than a century old forms of oppression. And so the executive orders that seek to fix this chromosomal at conception definition of sex are embodied in new rules against identification, sex being changed on forms of federal identification, new rules that have already been stayed in court about putting trans women in male populations and in carceral spaces, about actually seeking to overturn. It's suggested in the first order that the Trump administration released that they would actually seek changes to the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, so that it looks like part of their process, part of their goal might actually be to attack the definition of gender dysphoria itself and the notion that that trans individuals actually have a perspective that should be ameliorated or should be engaged in by medical practitioners, right? They want to get rid of that notion of gender identity that rises up in medicine and psychology in the 1950s and 1960s. So I just sort of wanted to offer you all that kind of historical perspective to think about this. I think that that really shifts the conversation in important ways and puts these executive orders in the proper context. Nick, how am I doing on time there?
Fabulous, Dan. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
We'll shift over now to Dr. Bart Elmore, who will take things in a more environmental direction.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Alex, and to my great friends, Dan and Maria and Clay. It's a pleasure to share the conversation with you. I'm an environmental historian, so Nick has tasked me with talking about environmental policy. So what I want to talk about is just there are 140 different actions that have been taken that have affected environmental policy in the last 100 days, 140 plus. So I can't talk about all of them. So I thought I would unpack three that I think are really important today for us to think about in historical context, and then we can have a larger conversation in the Q&A. And I thought I'd put some things up here on the screen so that people could see some of these major things that are happening. So the first thing I would highlight is that the current administration has moved to reverse something that's called the endangerment finding, which was issued by the EPA in 2009 that allowed the EPA to essentially regulate greenhouse gas emissions under a very old law, the Clean Air Act, which was actually passed in 1963, but was really solidified and strengthened under amendment in 1970. And essentially what the Clean Air Act did is said that the federal government could regulate pollutants coming out of cars and industry and so forth and so on. But pollutants had never been clarified to include greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, it was a case that really brought that to the fore, a case in recent history called Massachusetts versus EPA that was decided in 2008 by the Supreme Court in a very close decision, 5-4 decision, in which the Supreme Court decided that it was, in fact, under the purview of the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act, under this statute, if they made an endangerment finding, if they found that the public was being harmed by the emission of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this may have not have come across your radar, but it was a huge moment in history because it meant now that the EPA could then enforce various laws and regulations to target greenhouse gas reductions in the United States. Now, that endangerment finding was not made in 2008, in part because the Bush administration, EPA, did not want to move to make that endangerment finding. It happened under the Obama administration in 2009, under the EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson, who moved forward to make that endangerment finding. And it was a very big deal because it meant that you could pass various rules and regulations targeting greenhouse gas emissions. So as I was thinking about the number one thing I wanted to raise for all of us to think about, it's how big of a historical shift it is in 2025 when Lee Zeldin, the current EPA administrator, moved to, quote, reconsider this endangerment finding, because it sounds kind of wonky, but it turns out this is a big deal. If indeed the EPA finds that, there is no link between greenhouse gas emissions and public harm, this is going to be a big deal, and it'll reverse precedent that has several decades, that's been several decades in the making. The second thing that I thought I would highlight is perhaps something that might not on the face of it seem important, but I think it actually is extremely important. And it was the termination of the American Climate Corps program. Now, this was a program that was originally proposed by President Biden in 2020 with a vision of essentially creating hundreds of thousands of jobs for young people in the United States to fight climate change through various measures, from various things out in the environment to create resilience in terms of climate change adaptation, but also to do things like planting trees and other things to try and store carbon and prevent climate change. But due to the backlash from Republicans in Congress, it was not included in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which forced President Biden essentially to go forward without congressional aid. On Earth Day of 2024, he launched the program essentially without a big budget, with the new goal of essentially creating 20,000 jobs that would send young people out into the environment to do these kind of climate change jobs. But, and I should note that this was based on a wildly popular historical program called the Civilian Conservation Corps that was started by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933. It was actually based on a program that he initiated as governor of New York, inside of New York, before he became president. And he recognized how popular it was for his own political coalition building, in part because you were building, parks, and you were building shelter belts in the Dust Belt. You were doing all these different things that really connected the government to people in rural communities throughout the country. And 4 million some young people were involved in the Civilian Conservation Corps. It really broadened the base of the environmental movement, brought more people into thinking about ecological issues. But here again, this program was terminated immediately, were the words in the executive order on day one of the Trump presidency. I would say two things. One, this is something that Trump should think about from a political angle. This was an incredibly popular program that could have been a coalition builder for him that is now gone. But more importantly, thinking about the loss of those jobs to really address the issue of climate change. And so the third and final thing I would emphasize is probably something that's been on all of our minds. And we might think of this as in part a foreign policy issue, but it's of course also a domestic issue. And that is the pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord in 2025. This was on day one, executive order issued by Trump that announced the US was leaving this Paris Accord. The Paris Accord, I should note, was passed by President Obama, approved by President Obama by executive order. And that's important in 2015. It was not a treaty that had to be ratified by the Senate. And that's why it could be overturned so quickly by the next president coming in. It should be noted that Trump had done this before. We know this from history, what happens when we pull out of the Paris Accord. He made the announcement in 2017, but we ultimately pulled out in 2020. And so we have some precedent there, and I'd be happy to talk about this in the Q&A. I think the thing I would highlight that's more important, though, for us to think about is this, something that you might not have read in the news, which has a deeper history, which is Trump suggesting that he's going to pull out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, signed in 1992 by George H.W. Bush and ratified by the Senate, 2/3 of the Senate. And all I'll say here is that this would be a far more profound problem because this was the foundational agreement around which all the other climate negotiations, including the Paris Accord, are based. And again, it has Senate ratification. And one of the interesting historical questions is this constitutional? Can the president remove us from a treaty that was ratified by the Senate unilaterally? Now, Thomas Jefferson, back in the 19th century and 18th century, back in 1798 in the early 1800s, said very specifically that he believed that the legislature, having created these treaties through ratification, should be called upon to revoke them. Yet other legal scholars say the Constitution is mute on this point. It says that you need approval to ratify it, but do you need approval to get rid of it? Well, we're going to have to wait and see. And I think there's an interesting historical question here about all this, but it would profoundly disrupt the international negotiations that we see around the world. I'll leave it there for now, and I look forward to our conversation. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Bart. I'm going to pass the microphone over now to Dr. Clay Howard, and we'll talk a little bit about higher education over these first 100 days.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all of you for being here. I was thinking a little bit about how I would prepare my talk, and I saw this week the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, told Harvard that it shouldn't bother applying to federal grants anymore, and that $2.2 billion given to Harvard alone were suspended because Harvard refused to comply with a series of demands issued by the Trump administration that included data on hiring, admissions, an external review of programs to ensure ideological diversity within the university, as well as reviews of international students who were being overly critical of Israel. Harvard most famously refused to comply and is now fighting it out in court with the Trump administration. Columbia University did comply and is undergoing a review process with federal oversight. And there's a number of other universities that are facing this kind of fight over federal funding. And I thought, what exactly is the history behind universities getting that funding? And maybe none of us are like the kind of satellite scientists that get the top dollars at Ohio State, but we do work at a university, and therefore it's a subject I think that is close to our hearts. And so I think the thing to understand about this is that just like the Trump tariff policies have reversed a tendency among presidents and Congress alike to move away from tariffs, going all the way back to the New Deal, or Trump's conflicts with longtime allies like Canada or France or South Korea or other places, the fight over universities falls within a larger move away from a system that was put in place after World War II, which is like by no means a perfect system. Like it was absolutely a flawed system, but it had bipartisan support. And so let me give a couple of examples of like what that system looked like. So after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union had a long struggle, the Cold War. And the federal government, starting with the Truman administration, believed that universities would play an essential part in that fight. And so it was in 1948 that the National Institutes for Health were reorganized and became grant-making institutions. The National Science Foundation was created in 1950 to give money to researchers at universities across the country. And in the subsequent decades, federal funding through those agencies and others steadily expanded and transformed places like Stanford, Caltech into these like powerhouses of doing research that was both academic, but also in the national interest. And during the Great Society in the 1960s, Congress and the president advanced an agenda that tried to make universities more equitable and more fair. And the Higher Education Act of 1965 announced more funding for faculty, graduate students, student loans, Pell Grants, and a number of other ways to try and make college more affordable. The goals behind this system were, in the context of the Cold War, they wanted to like train the engineers. They wanted to have the laboratories that would develop the weapons, the satellites that would help the US wage the Cold War. But they also were waging what they saw as like an ideological struggle between communism in the Soviet Union and what Americans really unironically called free enterprise, as the government was subsidizing various kinds of innovations at colleges and universities to try and turn out the products that might be marketable, good for business, but would also demonstrate that the United States actually is a better place to live. It is better than the Soviet Union. Look at the cars, look at the appliances, and so forth. That pattern continued all the way up until this year of more and more funding for things like medical research, pharmaceutical research, and so forth, even after the Cold War ended. And it's part of a larger tendency among Americans to see that the job of the government is to stimulate economic growth. And so the Trump administration's fight with Harvard and other universities is in some ways a kind of turning away from that vision of like partnership between business, universities, and the government. The one other kind of detail that I imagine that some people might be familiar with is that Title IX is a part of amendments to the Higher Education Act from 1972 and requires universities to treat people equitably based on gender. And most famously, the Obama administration issued new guidelines to universities to require them to handle cases of sexual assault on campus differently. And they issued a whole series of guidelines. And the reason why universities were required to comply with it was because the law says all educational institutions getting federal assistance, and therefore it's the money that the government is giving through things like the NSF or the NIH or the Higher Education Act in general, which forces places like Ohio State or Harvard to comply with laws around civil rights and gender equality. No university lost funding over its failure to comply with the Title IX regulations issued by the Obama administration. And unlike the Trump administration, the Obama administration gave detailed rules about what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to follow it. And so a lot of places like Harvard are struggling to figure out, how am I supposed to deal with anti-Semitism on campus? What exactly qualifies? Who decides it? All of that is like very new. But since I guess people were wondering a little bit about Congress and executive power, there's a long-standing tradition of the president deciding how to handle funding through things like universities gets handled, going all the way back to the Truman administration, up through Obama, and now Trump. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Clay. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Maria Hammack will talk to us about questions about immigration and deportation and citizenship. Over to you, Maria. You'll have to unmute yourself. There we go.
I'm muting. Thank you so much, Nick. First and foremost, it's a privilege to be in the company of all of you, such brilliant scholars, and join this conversation to reflect on, the current moment. As we have all witnessed, April 30th marked the 100 days of Trump's presidency. And through this, we have seen extensive changes that have provoked at times much surprise, uncertainty, confusion, and of course, countless conversations that about what these changes mean for many aspects of society, for our legal systems, our roles, our role and stance in the global stage, and general for American life, and importantly for immigrants as well. So today I will focus, as many of my peers, on one of these key aspects that is, as we all know, at the heart of always has driven this presidency, and that is immigration. It is an issue that Trump ran on, and one of his main concerns, and the concerns of a lot of his supporters. And so, as he has claimed, he has issued proposals to fix, if you will, the immigration problem that he sees this country as having. And he ran on a very heavy campaign to center mass deportations. And he has to try to compare this drive for mass deportations and his policies very proudly to Eisenhower's 1954 Operation Wetback. And it has been, very, very blatant and very passionate, which of course, if we do look into the history of Operation Wetback, it today stands as one of the most lamentable episodes in our history that was driven, against immigrants, particularly Mexican nationals, but it was an episode or a time in our history where U.S. citizens were deported, legal residents were violently as well treated and mistreated. And we're starting to see some of those. We see people like Abrego Garcia, who was sent, he was for all matters, a legal protected resident, and he ended up in El Salvador. And I think his status is still very much up in the air, what's going to happen to him. But since day one, we have seen of this presidency, Trump has begun signing executive orders to begin revealing and I guess propelling forward the implementation of his planned immigration reforms, or what he calls his immigration reforms, if you will. On January 20th, for instance, he signed an executive order titled Protecting the American People Against Invasion. And this was aimed to stop, according to what the order states, and I'm quoting this, the unprecedented flood of illegal immigration into the United States invited and administered by the previous administration. So that's how it starts. And this executive order does situate immigrants in a very interesting light. And I'm quoting here, they are situated or painted as significant threats to national security and public safety, as people who regularly commit violent, heinous acts against innocent Americans, and has argued, so the way that this executive order painted immigrants, it argues that many of these unlawful aliens are abusing the generosity of the American people, costing taxpayers billions of dollars at all levels. And of course, we know that that is not necessarily correct. Immigrants pay billions of dollars into the economy, and often they actually cannot file taxes and get money back. So it creates this idea of immigrants as terrorists, in a very unnecessarily bad light. But beyond that, this first executive order revoked several previous executive orders, including Executive Order 14010, passed in February 2nd, 2021, that created a comprehensive regional framework to address the causes of immigration and to help manage migration throughout North and Central America. And that also provided a safe and orderly processing of asylum seekers in the United States. And that actually had allowed for or facilitated that processing at the border. And now that was taken away. The second order was 14011, also passed in 2021, which established the intra-agency task force on the reunification of families. So we see children at the border in cages. And so that was aimed to also reunify families, and particularly children who had been at the border for long periods of time. And so this executive order, this first one actually revokes those, but it also prioritized the prosecution of criminal offenses related to unauthorized entry or continued unauthorized presence of aliens in the United States. It also created or prompted for the creation of a task force to end the presence of what was being argued, that the presence of criminal cartels, foreign gangs, and transnational criminal organizations throughout the United States. And the idea was to help dismantle cross-border human smuggling and trafficking networks, and to, and that was how it was being portrayed. But in reality, a lot of those issues that that this executive order presented are not necessarily the issues that are, on the ground, particularly at the moment. But in addition to that, it called for the identification of unregistered legal aliens, the creation of detention facilities, the establishment of VOICE, which is the office in addressing victims of crimes committed by removable aliens, which is a branch of ICE that offers proactive, timely, and adequate professional service to victims, or we're supposed to provide services to victims of crimes committed by, if you will, these removable aliens that they are situating immigrants as. And here, since time is of the essence, I will focus on a few salient items that have come to be implemented, or at least attempted to be implemented by the administration. One of the major things, or the main things, that I think was the cancellation of CBP-1, which was or facilitated the asylum seeking at the border. And it was an application that immigrants who were trying to reach the border, they could easily apply and seek asylum, and had allowed thousands of immigrants that had reached the border since 2023 to present themselves at the border to officially seek asylum. But instead, CBP-1 has now become CBP Home. So it's the same app, but it just transformed and into CBP Home. And so instead of being an application to facilitate the petition of asylum, which CBP-1 was, instead CBP Home has turned to be an app that migrants use to, or could use to self-deport, to auto-deport. And of course, a lot of this information has now been given to people at the border, or to individuals who were using CBP-1 to seek asylum. But if they continue to use it, they have instead been self-deporting, or like registering and self-deporting. So it has created a lot of confusion and, of course, a lot of fears. Beyond that, on April 27, Trump signed an executive order against sanctuary cities, and that order further calls for the creation of a list that identifies those sanctuary cities, with the caveat that if these sanctuary cities refuse to be added to the roster, to this list, that will mark them as ineligible for federal funding. So again, it's created a lot of chaos and a lot of uncertainty with a lot of these organizations and spaces that have served historically as sanctuary cities. But this is not necessarily a new thing. Registering migrants or registering sanctuary cities, it has not been. It's not an unprecedented thing. Legal migrants, for instance, have been required since 1950 and up until 1981 to report their addresses and their names. And failure to do so was considered a misdemeanor. And that actually ended in 1981 when Reagan signed a bill that eliminated that particular registration. And of course, in March last month, the Trump administration tried to revoke the legal status of more than 550,000 Cuban, Venezuelan, Nicaraguans, and Haitian migrants, legal migrants that had already gone through the process. And of course, in April, a federal court revoked or blocked that particular revocation of the legal status. And today, actually, this morning, the Trump administration asked the Supreme Court to intervene, and so to counter that and let it pass. So we're still going to see how that, what happens with that in the next few days or weeks, perhaps. And we've seen this before as well, where the U.S. has revoked the legal status of individuals, of migrants, of legal migrants, primarily through the process that we call denaturalization. We saw it in the 20th century, where the U.S. pursued and obtained the denaturalization of individuals, particularly found individuals that were found involved in Nazi war crimes and other terrorists. But even long before that, we see, starting in 1817, where the U.S. issued a series of restrictive immigration policies, and this included bans on a lot of people that the U.S. deemed criminals, people with contagious diseases, even anarchists, polygamists, and other groups. And as well, they issued other restrictions that targeted the rising number of, particularly, as we know, Asian migrants, right? First limiting migration from China and later banning migration from a lot of other Asian countries. So a lot of these processes and actions or acts that we've seen in the past 100 days that may seem to a lot of us as unprecedented, as many of you have mentioned, actually have long roots or deep roots in our histories, and particularly in this border, U.S.-Mexico border, and border crossings, where we see these immigration policies really heavily affecting people. So, and I'll conclude by mentioning that the administration's revocation of student visas, at least, I think it's at least 300. But I think there's some sources that have been investigating, like Al Jazeera and other venues that have tabulated the number to be over 1,400 visas have been revoked from across 250 universities today. And I wanted to end with this because that is, it's 200 from over 250 universities, including our university, Ohio State. It's directly affecting our students. And we have, a number of them that have been deported not only just for protesting, for instance, standing for protests for pro-Palestinian, but also for minor. They've been revoking visas for minor infractions like traffic violations and other minor legal infractions. And we have, of course, we have a very visible stories like Mahmoud Khalil, Mohsen Madawi. We have another student, Senya Petrova, Shiata Liu, and a lot of others who have their visas revoked within the last 100 days. And so students are very much being affected through a lot of these new immigration policies that, of course, have had long histories, or have been part of our long shared histories. And I will end at that, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you all so much for your insights. I mean, it's amazing to see all the different areas of American life that are are being changed or have been changed in the past few years, but it's also an important reminder of the ways in which there is, as they say, nothing new under the sun, that these are all questions and patterns that in some respects we've seen before in different variants, and that these are questions and patterns that have long history in America. So as much as much of this feels new, it is all deeply embedded, going back. I mean, we went all the way back to the 18th century, deeply embedded in the long-term patterns of this country and the debates that we've had over those years. So that's extraordinarily helpful to all of you. Extraordinarily helpful from all of you to remind us of that longer history. We've had some questions that have come in, and I want to jump first to climate, Bart. There was a couple of questions that had to do with your mention of kind of climate issues. So and I'm going to put two parts together. One is, can you just kind of quickly define climate change? And also, could you expand a little bit on your statement that hundreds of thousands of jobs would have been created for climate change through this program, and kind of what types of jobs would have been created to address climate change issues, and our audience member would love to know who would be funding their paychecks.
Great. Two great questions. So the first one is define climate change. Climate change is the prolonged or significant alterations or changes in climate that occur, in this case, due to anthropogenic interventions in the climate, in this case, caused by greenhouse gases. So that is one way of putting it. And I think going back to the historical record is where we want to go when we say, what is climate change? Because people will say, hasn't climate always been changing? In the sense of the modern definition of this term, what we're talking about is looking at significant alterations in our climate that are caused by adjustments in atmospheric emissions or atmospheric concentrations of things like carbon dioxide, which is actually not a very powerful greenhouse gas. Probably the biggest is methane, one of the largest greenhouse gas contributors. But you can see that, yes, we've seen atmospheric changes at all sorts of times in history. This is due to ice core samples that we have, in fact, at Byrd Polar Center here at Ohio State, that show what atmospheric conditions of carbon dioxide was going back hundreds of thousands of years. And what we're talking about when we're talking about the contemporary moment of climate change is this moment, where you can see this kind of vast acceleration of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. We're now approaching 420 parts per million. And this is what we mean by the kind of really abnormal changes to our atmosphere that results in things like this, where you can see this kind of precipitous rise in the global temperatures over time. This is coming from NASA, by the way. I would recommend to anyone who wants to dive into what we now know from the top scientists around the world about this. And you can see that these kind of map on to one another. We say climate change, I should note too, as opposed to global warming, because depending on where you are and at what time of year, you could be experiencing different types of climate effects as a result of this. For example, polar vortexes that bring down cold air sometimes are a cause of actually warming in certain portions of the world. But if you're in, say, Ohio at that moment, you might feel that polar vortex, which is why I say, well, it's cold. Why is climate change? Well, it's because a lot of things are happening. So for anyone who'd love to talk more about it, we do a study abroad here at Ohio State that takes people to the front lines of the climate battle. We spend time with the top climate scientists around the world, and I'd love to talk more. On funding, I would just say for the Climate Corps, the original plan was to try and have it budgeted into the Inflation Reduction Act, so it would have been federally funded, which would have meant tax dollars. So this would have been you and I paying for that. If we go back to the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s, that's exactly how it was funded and paid for. In fact, it was $25 per person per month. And interestingly, the way that it functioned was that most of the money actually went back to families in urban areas and the cities. In fact, the person who was working, the young person who was out in the fields, maybe planting trees in a national park, only received a small portion of that money. And the idea was to see if we could channel money during the Depression into communities that really needed it most, and oftentimes in urban areas where many of these young people were coming from. So it was a pretty unique design to it, design to distribute that funding in a way that would really help people in one of the hardest economic periods in our history during the Great Depression. I think I've used too much time, Nick. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Bart. We have a couple of questions that deal with kind of international comparisons and what can we learn from other countries. I'm going to send this your way, Dan, if that's okay. So one is, I mean, broadly, kind of what can we learn from other countries who have undergone rapid change like this, or where there's concerns about the collapse of rule of law, or a move in a more as they say in Hungary, in a more liberal type of direction. And in particular, we had a question from a gay man in the audience who was wondering about, really a kind of heartfelt question about how long he should stay in this country, and particularly thinking about what happened to gay people in Nazi Germany. Do you have thoughts for him? And this may be beyond your kind of what you can do, but in terms of how long does one wait, and are there real threats to people's lives in this regard, in a way that have been seen in other countries? Maybe Nazi Germany is an unfair comparison. Maybe there are other places that were less extreme, but nonetheless equally as intolerant and kind of violent.
Absolutely. Such critical, important questions. And I guess I think of it from two perspectives. One is, as someone who grew up in the 1970s in a very out proud lesbian household, I would simply sort of commiserate with the participant about the long arc of the struggle for full citizenship for LGBT people in the United States. Just the differences, and maybe now sadly similarities, between what it was like for me growing up and my family are striking, right? And part of that is the awareness that we still do not have sexual orientation or gender identity as suspect categories as applied to the equal protection and due process clauses of the Fifth Amendment for federal and the 14th Amendment for state government. It's an important thing to note that under the Biden administration, the Department of Justice had begun to prosecute sex discrimination cases that involved trans individuals under the Equal Protection Clause of the Fifth Amendment. The Trump executive order, that one of them that I've been talking about, specifically rescinds that and pulls back from that. So for a minute, trans rights actually were included in a really groundbreaking way in equal protection constitutional rights. Sexual orientation, we haven't seen any move. I mean, there's been Supreme Court decisions like Obergefell same-sex marriage that move in that direction, but it hadn't come to fruition. So that leaves LGBT individuals, families, communities in a vulnerable position that they've been in for my whole life, and obviously for decades and decades before. So that's one way to just sort of be an ally for that question, to keep company in that vulnerability. But to the larger question of authoritarian governments and the dangers that they pose, I'm a bit of a layperson. I'm a U.S. historian, but if we think about the horrific rise of the Reich, the singular moment, I would say, and I would be curious whether historians specifically of that moment agree with me, would be the Enabling Act in 1933, which granted the Reich power to implement laws without the permission of the parliament. That the separation of powers and the checks and balances is really the deeply most fundamental part of our bulwark against the kind of authoritarianism that we see with the rise of the Reich. And so we all, I think, as citizens of the United States, are watching to see whether the checks and balances, for instance, whether Congress retains the right to perform a check and balance on the executive office, whether the judicial still operates in that capacity. I think that's a fundamental question that we need to be asking ourselves and looking out for. I guess I would think about that. Anyway, thank you very much, Brian, for a great question.
Yeah, and we actually had, in some ways, a follow-up to that whole question of the checks and balances in the different branches of government. One of the participants has noted the ways in which, obviously, a lot of the changes recently have been done through executive order, and there's been some pushback through legal channels, in part because there have been legal suits that have been filed, and so it's moving its way through the court system. But it seems that Congress is not responding to to many of these kinds of these executive orders and actions. Are there other moments in history that can help us to understand moments like this, where different branches of the government are not acting as the check or balance in the way that the founders had intended?
Can I say something about that? I don't know that I'll directly answer it, but what's so interesting to me about this panel and a lot of the coverage is that the focus on the 100 days comes from the New Deal, and the New Deal that the Roosevelt administration, but also Democrats and Congress, promised the American public. And so, first of all, it's interesting that we're having a 100 days conversation about a second-term president. Like, that's notable in and of itself. But also, the New Deal was a flurry of legislation. The 100 days was like act after act after act from Congress, and Roosevelt was like signing them. It was not a series of executive orders. And I don't know if another panelist can correct me. Has Congress passed anything in the last 100 days? Like has there been a single law that we have talked about at all? Like that I think is like really notable in and of itself. The obvious parallel in history to more directly answer the question, Nick, the most would be, of course, the Watergate scandal and the hearings in the 1970s. That came after, like decades of the Vietnam War, all kinds of things that were not being investigated, but it did involve Republicans and Democrats working together to ultimately push Nixon out of office. It's the only precedent I can think of in recent history.
Maria, we just to kind of shift from branches of government to policies of immigration, we had a question sort of asking, why is it that it has proven so difficult for the United States to develop a kind of coherent and generally accepted within the larger population immigration policy? I mean, is the U.S. unusual in this way? I mean, have other countries been able to figure out these questions, or is there something? Is this a common issue? Is this something particular to the United States? Are there moments that were decisive historically in setting the stage for today, where there's so much ongoing debate and rancor around this question?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, but it's also a very complex one. We have seen throughout our history that there has been episodes almost cyclical where immigration has taken central stage, particularly in the shared relationships between Mexico and the United States, for instance. But this has not, like if you will, the immigration problems that we have today, I would say, are not as pressing as other administrations. For instance, we know that, for instance, during the Obama administrations, that's when we saw like dire issues like children in cages, right? I think under the Obama administration, there were more immigrants deported ever since, even more than other administrations before or after, even more than there were under Trump's first administration. And so I think that the administration is situating these pressing issues of immigration and migrants, and also situating migrants as terrorists, is creating or exacerbating these issues or these fears, and these how the American public is seeing not only immigrants as invasors or as criminals as they have been portrayed, but also as individuals who shouldn't be here, individuals who need to be gone. And it has affected not only those that are seeking asylum or those that are trying to come, but those that are already here with legal status. And it's, for instance, Cubans, Venezuelans, and Haitian migrants have particular Cubans have had a historic, as you know, official asylum, official processes to come in, and the fact that they wanted to revoke those historic legal precedents is even more problematic than the issues that they think we have with immigration. And it's situating this idea that the border right now, it's like that people are crossing the border rampantly and that there's everybody's trying to come in. But if you are at the border, you see there are no more, like there were more lines under the first administration, under Obama's administration. But today, you know, it's not as pressing, I would say, as the administration executive orders have come to reflect or situate that. So it's interesting, and I think we're going to continue seeing a lot of that rhetoric. But I think only time will tell. Like in the next 100 days, we'll see how it's different than other administrations or what they're going to do. At the end of the day, sometimes a lot of these issues are not resolved. You know, migration and border crossings have happened for hundreds of years, and I don't think, you know, even if they do a lot of these policies and pass all these acts, people will continue to cross the border in the very many ways that they have been for the past 100 years.
Thank you. Let me sneak in one more question, which I suppose in some ways speaks to this panel as historians. But so the question is, has it happened before that history, that is the study of the past in the US, was kind of erased or hidden or transformed so that Americans became in some ways, you know, there was a sort of absence of kind of correct history because the educational system had been transformed. This seems to be a question that comes out of worry of changes, obviously in the Department of Education and this sort of thing, but also probably can be expanded beyond just history itself. Also thinking about the ways in which certain types of information that the government used to provide for the public is no longer provided, such as weather information, for example, that seems to be a kind of problem or a threat for farmers and for others. So I'm interested if you can speak to, are there historical moments where you have these shifts in terms of what we understand and what we don't understand, particularly in terms of what the federal government is allowing to be said and not be said?
I'll step in here.
Dan. Yeah, Dan, please.
You know, I've been thinking a lot about my sort of the most powerful example of this for me. If we think about the history of slavery, of American slavery, which was something that I really had the great honor of studying under George Frederickson in graduate school, one of the great masters of that history. And he taught me that for most of the 20th century, from 1900 up until the late 1960s, one of the most dominant sort of schools of thought that came out of higher education and influenced textbooks all the way down through the educational system was this thing called the Dunning School. And it turns out that the Dunning School had this vision of the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction that painted that moment as being a tragic invasion of the North into the South, as a time where the sort of specter of slavery was held up to invade and police the South. And really, this Dunning School perpetuated a vision of slavery that horrifically painted slavery as this almost benevolent operation in the South, right? This was a white supremacist view of slavery. It didn't have anything to do with the history, the ubiquitous history of brutality that we now overwhelmingly have proof of. But it's what made it into the high school and elementary school textbooks, the high school textbooks about slavery. This changed only when the modern Black freedom struggle emerges in the late 60s and 1970s, and really makes it, you know, speaks irrefutably about the reality of the history of slavery that had been documented by W.E.B. Du Bois as early as the 1930s, but hadn't ever been accepted in the school system. And so something as massive as that, right, can really affect the whole way generations and generations of Americans think about history, about U.S. history, in devastating ways. And I find myself thinking about the dominance of the Dunning School over such a critical moment, topic in our history a lot these days. So thanks for the question.
And Dan, I'll just add that, like, I know Nick and I often talk about optimism in moments like this, because I think sometimes, whether it's climate change or whatever it might be, we're dealing with some pretty big issues. And I think one of the positives you could say is that as much as our school system is there are so many problems, and I think we're really facing an issue of people not getting access to quality education in many places. If we go back to that night, if we go back to Reconstruction, I mean, the American South didn't have public schools until that moment. Freedmen's schools were the first real public schools of the American South, created by the Freedmen's Bureau in the 1860s. Before that, you think about the utter lack of public education for most Americans in the United States. Of course, Horace Mann, going back to the 1830s, and others would have been planting the seeds of kind of this public school system. So as much as our system is broken, we still have one. And I think, there are things to think about when we think about what it must have been like to kind of try and navigate a time before there was even an FDA or anything to regulate or think about what information people were getting out there. We at least live in a time where we still have these institutions, which should make us want to fight for them even more, given that we still have these institutions that have such a storied history to making America better. So just wanted to flag a little bit of optimism in this moment.
And I can add that I think, yes, erasure is certainly an issue here, where it's a lot of these histories in the past have not been taught. Like, for instance, some of the topics that I teach about the Underground Railroad that led to Mexico, which has historically long undertold. Those stories are usually not as visual as those of the Underground Railroad to Canada, and to think about migrants crossing the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, in the opposite direction than today, like less than 200 years ago, is going into Mexico as opposed to those coming into this country, seems like an erased history, right? And in many ways it is. It is not taught in many schools. It is definitely not taught in Mexico, and it is not taught in the U.S. and certainly not in Canada. So the erasure is extensive, but also it could be episodes of collective or historical amnesia, like, for instance, what I mentioned a bit earlier, that in 1931, with Operation Wetback, we saw, I think, 4 million migrants deported, and about half of that, I think it was about, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was about 2 million, about half of that, or no, it was 2 million immigrants deported, and about half of that, so about 1 million, were either U.S. citizens or legal migrants that were actually deported. And today you hear this, and I've been here in Mexico for the past couple weeks, and you start seeing this, like, like the vision or the understanding of the U.S. and, like, oh, they're going to deport U.S. citizens, and you hear that in the U.S. as well, the fear of, like, how are they going to deport U.S. citizens? But it's happened before, and we've dealt with that, I mean, in some way. And so I think that it's not necessarily the history has been erased, it's perhaps that the history has been forgotten in some ways, have been not taught or as highlighted as other histories. We tend to highlight certain things that we think important, and perhaps some episodes, because they tend to be so tragic or so lamentable, perhaps we go around them or not highlight them. And that does a disservice to many of us, to all of us, to all of our students, because then they believe that these things are erased. But they're there now in the age of social media and access to the internet. Anybody can read upon that, but if it's not highlighted in school, perhaps you don't get to understand it or engage with those histories.
And one small point, Maria, just to build up that, you said the internet. And I would just point to a historian's tool. A lot of people might be afraid about the erasure of government information. I'm an environmental person, right? Thinking about NOAA and all this data being pulled down. I mean, one of the other optimistic things here is technology. And one of the things we use in the scholars of the 20th century and 21st century, especially in the internet age, is what's called the Wayback Machine. And I thought just for fun, I would show you what the Wayback Machine can do when you put in osu.edu and you go back to February 13th of 1997. This is what our website used to look like back then.
Oh, wow.
And this is kind of a funny just thing to show what we can do. But it turns out the Wayback Machine can allow us to go see data that has been supposedly taken down by government institutions or whatever it might be, and actually to see stories that are trying to be erased. We use this a lot in my field when I'm looking at businesses and the environment to see what businesses were saying about their products in 1997. Oh, wait, that product's now cancerous. We're going to take it down. Well, we can now still see how they pitched it back then. So it turns out we have a lot of tools, I think, using the internet. And even though things it might seem like things are being erased, there are still ways to kind of capture those stories. I'd really encourage, especially the teachers out there, maybe to think about the Wayback Machine.
Clay, do you want to have one last word?
I was just going to say that this goes well beyond my, what I plan to talk about in my 5 minutes, but I saw some of the questions that came in and questions about Nazi Germany and democratic backsliding. And I think all those concerns are really valid. And I think people, have reason to be concerned, right? If they're transgender or undocumented or all kinds of things like that. But I guess I also wanted to end, this conversation reminds me that the writer Rebecca Solnit says some of the best parts of American history have been brought up by the worst parts. And that, we haven't focused on the long histories of resistance and, the first 100 days have had a lot of really dark moments, but I don't think, history is not over. And I think that there's a lot of things yet to come that might breed more optimistic conversations in the future.
It's a great note to end on. We could talk about this all day and probably all weekend. But it is, and I appreciate the tone of so many of the comments that have really pointed not just to what we can learn from history, but also the ways in which history gives us ways forward, gives us paths for optimism, gives us way of envisioning different types of approaches. We've come to the end of our time, and I just wanted to thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm very grateful to Drs. Elmore, Hammack, Howard, and Rivers for sharing their expertise and thoughts today. Please join me in giving them a virtual round of applause. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'd also like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences, especially Alex Stacklane, the Department of History, the Clio Society, the Goldberg Center, and Origins Current Events in Historical Perspective for their support of this event. And once again, thank you, our audience, for joining us today and for your excellent questions. Please stay safe and healthy, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.